There's a place in this water where the boats always turned. Not because of the depth. The water there was shallow, yes, but not dangerously so. Not because of hidden rocks. Not because of any mark on any chart. The boats turned there because that was where the boats turned, a tradition so old in the Korean fishing community of this stretch of Washington coast that nobody Sung Jae Lim had ever met could say who started it, or when, or precisely why. You didn't cross that line. The elders had always said so. The young men learned it the way they learned everything else, by doing it alongside the people who already knew. Sung Jae was 58 years old. He had been turning his boat at that place for 30 years. His mother had fished this coast for 22 years before she stopped. She had learned the turning place from the women who came before her in the 1950s and 60s, when first Korean families found their way to this section of Washington water and built a small commercial fleet around what the bay offered. She had learned it in Korean, in conversation, in the particular practical shorthand of people who needed to communicate essential information quickly and didn't always have a shared language with fine distinctions. When she retired, she had given him one thing, a hand-drawn map. She had not mentioned it for the last 3 years she fished. She had simply made it one evening, when she had decided it was time to stop, sitting at the kitchen table with a pen and a sheet of paper from the printer. She drew for about 40 minutes without referring to anything except her memory of 40 years on this coast. When she finished, she folded it and handed it to him and said, "Everything I know is on there." He had not asked her to elaborate, because she was not a person who elaborated, and because he understood that the map was the elaboration. In the Lim family, knowledge had always traveled this way, compressed into practice, embedded in action, passed forward in the form of what you did rather than what you said about it. His mother had fished for 40 years before drawing the map. The 40 years were the real map. The piece of paper was just a way of making 40 years fit in a jacket pocket. The paper was copy paper. It was not archival. It was not designed to last. It was not a careful drawing. It was a working document. The bay's outline approximated, the major landmarks sketched in and across the surface of it, written in Korean, a scattering of place names. The names her community had given to locations that had no official designation: productive grounds, dangerous areas, seasonal patterns, the places that mattered to people who worked this water and had been working it long enough to have named things. One location on the map was marked with a word that Sung Jae had always translated, roughly, as the turning place, where you came about, where you stopped going and turned back. He had assumed it was navigational, a shallow bar, perhaps, or a current that made the approach unreliable. He had been wrong about this for 30 years. The tradition had been so thoroughly practical in its form. Turn here, this is where you turn, that the ecological reasoning inside it had become invisible. It was like knowing that you checked the bilge every morning without remembering that the reason was the specific leak pattern of a particular generation of hull. The practice survived. The reason for practice got compressed into practice itself, until it became just a thing you did. He understood the map differently on the February morning of the herring spawn. He had known the herring spawned somewhere near this tidal delta for as long as he had been fishing the area. He knew it the way he knew most things about this bay, not from any formal study, not from any government report, but from 30 years of watching where the gulls gathered in February, where the water changed texture when the spawn milt ran, where the other boats avoided going because everyone understood that was where the spawn happened. He had seen the spawn every February for 30 years. He had turned his boat at the turning place every February for 30 years. He had never, in 30 years, connected these two facts. The morning he connected them, he was sitting in his boat at the turning place in February, watching the gulls over the delta, watching the water go that particular milky quality that happened when herring release their eggs and milt into the shallows. He was sitting exactly at the line where the boats had always turned. And he understood, all at once, that the line wasn't navigational. It was ecological. You didn't cross the delta during the spawn, not because you couldn't, because crossing, the engine disturbance, the wake, the propeller turbulence in those Pacific shallows, would disturb the spawn. The tradition that said turn here was a tradition that said protect this. It had been protecting it for as long as the community had been working this water, without ever needing to explain itself in those terms. because everyone who mattered already understood. The Port Authority's dock extension was planned for the Delta. He drove home and got the map out. The map was water damage at one corner, the paper softened and slightly wavy from a kitchen flood several years back. His mother's handwriting was intact. Korean characters in a confident hand. The names clear even where the paper had wrinkled. He photographed it with his phone. He photographed it from multiple angles, in different light, making sure the text was legible. He sent the photographs to his younger cousin, who had grown up more Korean fluent than Sung-jae and worked as a translator in Seattle, and asked her to make sure he was reading the turning place correctly. She called him back the same afternoon. She said, "You've always translated it as turning place, and that's basically right, but the full phrase is closer to this, where you come about because of what is beneath. It's a navigation term, yes, but the word for beneath doesn't mean the bottom. It means what's living in the bottom, what's happening in the bottom." She said, "Your translation was technically correct and missed the whole meaning." He asked her to say the phrase in Korean. She said it. He recognized the sounds from his childhood, from his mother saying it to him at the dock when he was learning where not to go. He had never known what the individual words meant. He had known where to turn. The meaning of the phrase had been in the turning, not in the language, and so the language had never needed to be translated. He sat with that for a long time. The Port Authority's preferred alignment for the dock extension put the structure's footprint directly over the Delta's most active spawn area. He had watched the herring congregate in that exact section every February for 3 decades. The section his mother's map had marked as the place where you turned because of what was living in the bottom. He called the Port Authority's project office and requested to speak at the environmental review. The review session was held at the Port Authority's offices in the second week of October. About 40 people attended. Sung-jae had brought 2 things: his phone, with a photograph of the map, and a folder containing 30 years of his own rough notes about where and when he'd seen herring spawn activity in the bay. The notes were not formal records. They were the kind of thing a fisherman wrote in the margins of tide tables and on the backs of equipment receipts. Dates, locations, approximate spawn extent, how long the milt ran, what the gull activity looked like. He had kept them because the spawn timing affected where he could fish and when, and knowing the pattern was useful, not because he had anticipated needing to present them to anyone. He explained the turning place. He showed the map photographs. He explained what his cousin had told him about the phrase. He described 30 years of spawn observations in the Delta. The Port Authority's fisheries consultant, a careful man named Dr. Hadley, said the herring spawning habitat documentation for this bay did not include the tidal delta. He said the state's herring spawning baseline records, which went back to the late 1970s, showed no confirmed spawn sites in this section of the coast. He said the delta was not included in the Environmental Review's Protected Habitat Assessment because it was not in the state's records as a spawn site. Sung-jae said, "It's not in the state's records because nobody from the state has ever come out in February and looked." Dr. Hadley said the Environmental Review's timeline did not allow for a February survey prior to the planned construction start. Sung-jae said the spawn would happen in February whether or not it was in the review timeline. Dr. Hadley said he would note the concern in the project record. Construction was approved in December. He had expected this, not with bitterness. With a particular resignation on a man who had lived long enough to understand the difference between what he knew and what he could prove, and that the gap between those 2 things was where most of his life's frustrations lived. He kept fishing through the winter. In January, he began paying closer attention to the Delta than he had in previous years. Not because he expected to find anything new, but because he wanted to be certain about what he already knew. He logged the first gull concentrations over the Delta on January 28th, a week earlier than usual. He logged the first visible milt on February 3rd, in the exact section of the Delta where the Port Authority's dock footprint was planned to sit. He sent the photographs to Dr. Hadley. He received a brief acknowledgement. He was aware in those weeks that he might be building a case for something that had already been decided. The permits were approved. The contract was signed. The equipment was scheduled to arrive in April. He also thought about his mother at the kitchen table, drawing the map. She had not drawn it because she thought anyone else would ever need it. She had drawn it because she was leaving a life she had spent 40 years building, and the things she had learned on this coast deserved to be somewhere outside her own head. The action of drawing the map was the action of someone who understood that knowledge was only as durable as the person carrying it. He kept logging. He sent each week's observations to Dr. Hadley and to the State Fisheries Office. He sent them to the community organization that represented the Korean fishing families on this stretch of coast. He was not sure any of it would matter. He was certain that not doing it would make everything worse. There was a practical component to this certainty. If the construction went ahead and the spawn was affected, the record of his observations would be the only evidence that the spawn had existed before the dock arrived. Without the evidence, the consequence couldn't be traced to the cause. He had watched this happen with other harbor changes in his years on this water. Things disappeared, and nobody could prove what they'd been, because nobody had written them down while they were still there. And there was another component, less practical. His mother had given the map because she believed the things she knew deserved to be somewhere outside her own head. He was doing what she had done. He was putting things outside his head. He did not know yet whether it would be enough. In late February, something unexpected happened. A sport fishing guide named Carrasco, who ran whale-watching trips out of the same arena and had no particular professional stake in the herring spawn, contacted Sung-jae after hearing about the dock project to the marina community. Carrasco said he had been seeing herring spawn in the Delta every February for 16 years. That was one of the most reliable events on his coastal observation calendar, and that his clients regularly saw the associated whale feeding that the spawn attracted. He had photographs, 16 years of photographs, taken from his whale-watching boat, of the herring spawn in the exact section of the Delta where the dock was planned. The photographs were geotagged. The earliest ones were from 2007. Sung-jae had not known about the photographs. He had not known about Carrasco's 16 years of observation. He had been watching the same event from a different boat, in a different professional context, and it had not occurred to him that someone else had been documenting what he was watching. Together, Sung-jae's 30 years of marginal notes and Carrasco's 16 years of geotag photographs represented something that neither of them had on their own, a multi-source, independently documented, decades-long record of a herring spawn that the state's official baseline didn't know existed. Sung-jae thought about this for a while, about two people watching the same thing from different boats, for different reasons with different tools, and neither of them knowing about the other until a dock project forced the question. The spawn had been visible to both of them. It had simply been visible in forms that didn't naturally combine. Carrasco's photographs lived on a hard drive in a whale-watching business office. Sung-jae's notes lived in the margins of tide tables he had mostly thrown away. The knowledge existed. It had just been dispersed across people who had no mechanism for finding each other until something threatened what they both knew. They filed a joint formal comment with the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife. The state biologist who received the joint comment was a woman named Dr. Won, who ran the department's herring program. She had been trying to fill gaps in the coastal herring spawn baseline for years. The state's records were incomplete. The surveys were expensive, the coastline was long, and the spawn happened in a narrow window that was easy to miss if you weren't already watching. She read the joint comment in an afternoon and made 3 phone calls by the following morning. The first call was to the Port Authority, requesting a construction delay pending an emergency habitat assessment. The second was to Carrasco, to request a complete photograph archive. The third was to Sung-jae, to ask about the map. She came to his house the following week. She sat at the kitchen table where his mother had drawn the map, and Sung-jae laid a printed enlargement of the photograph in front of her. His mother's handwriting, the Korean place names, the turning place marked in its corner of the bay. She asked him to explain the full phrase. He told her what his cousin had said, where you come about because of what is beneath, what's living in the bottom. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that phrase is a description of substrate-level spawning behavior. What's living in the bottom during the spawn is the egg mat. Herring lay their eggs in the eelgrass substrate and on gravel beds in the shallows. The phrase your mother used is not a navigation term. It's a biological description. Whoever named that place understood what the herring were doing there. She asked when the Korean community had started fishing this coast. Sung-jae said the first families arrived in the early 1950s. He said they had learned this stretch of Washington water quickly, the way people learn things they need to survive, from what the bay showed them and from each other. She said, So this spawn site has been known to this community for at least 70 years, and it's been protected by a navigation practice for at least 70 years. And it never made it into the state's official baseline because nobody thought to ask the people who were protecting it. She said this without bitterness and without accusation, as a statement of a gap, a professional recognition of the shape of something that had been missing from the picture she worked with every day. She picked up the photograph of the map and looked at it for a long time. The construction delay held. The emergency habitat assessment, conducted in the following February with Dr. Wen's team on the water for the full spawn window, confirmed what Sungjae and Carrasco had been documenting. The Tidal Delta was an active herring spawn site, extensive, historically consistent, ecologically significant. The Port Authority redesigned the dock extension. The new alignment moved the footprint north, away from the Delta's primary spawn area, adding cost and construction time, but preserving the habitat that the survey had now officially confirmed. The state's herring spawning baseline was updated. The Delta was added as confirmed site, with a note in the data record citing the sources: Carrasco's photographic archive, Sungjae's marginal notes, and the Korean fishing community's traditional navigation practice. The map was not included in the official record. There was no formal mechanism for including hand-drawn maps with Korean place names in a state fisheries database. But Dr. Wen had asked Sungjae, at the end of their kitchen table conversation, whether she could make a copy for her department's informal working files. He had said yes. He knew what an informal working file meant. It meant someone who cared to put it somewhere it might be useful someday, in a particular way that careful people created unofficial continuity alongside the official kind. Not because the system allowed it, but because the person inside the system understood that the system's categories were not the same as the available knowledge. It was not the same as a record, but it was the map, and the map was more than he had expected to have a year ago. Sungjae was on the water in February the following year, on the morning the spawn began. He had come to the turning place the way he had always come to it. 30 years of muscle memory bringing the boat about at the same invisible line. He cut the engine and let the boat drift. The herring were there. The water was going milky at the edges of the shallower section. The gulls were starting to gather. The dock structure was visible to the north, in its new alignment, its footprint clear of the delta. He sat in the drifting boat and looked at the map photograph on his phone, his mother's handwriting, the turning place in the corner of the bay. He thought about her sitting at the kitchen table in an afternoon, drawing the bay from memory. Not because she thought it would be important, because she was leaving a working life and she wanted to give him something practical. Here is what I know. Here is where things are. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. He thought about the first families who came here in the 1950s, watching where the herring came in February, learning not to cross there, passing that knowledge forward in the only form available to people who were still learning a new coast in a language they were still learning. Not a document, a practice. Turn here. Come about here, because of what is beneath. The spawn was happening the way it always happened, indifferent to the previous year's meetings and assessments and revised construction alignments. The herring came in February, because February was when they came. They had been coming here since before anyone alive had watched them. They would be coming here long after the boats that turned for them were gone. The gulls settled on the water ahead of him. Sungjae started the engine. He turned the boat.